So what happened to bipartisanship? It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dee Cutshaw, who is actually a Rotarian in 2 clubs. She's at the Social Justice Club, which is our satellite club, the Satellite Club of Knightdale. She's also a full-time member of the Durham Rotary Club, and her husband is a member of that club too. But Dee has an interesting background. She is a graduate of Duke University in economics and also New York University in finance. But what impressed me is that she broke the glass ceiling on Wall Street. She was served as the youngest vice president at age 25 on a Wall Street firm. For the last 16 years, she's been an entrepreneur, the founder and CEO of a family wealth services organization. And today she's going to describe her experience being on the White House staff, where she, can you believe this, hand screened over 80,000 resumes and looking for appointments for bipartisan boards and commissions. So without any further ado, Dee Cutshaw, welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. All right. So Marie, would you like to do the slides or would you like me to share screen?
Why don't you see if you can do it, but I'll see if I can get it back up.
I think I can do it. Let me just go down and pick this up and you should see it. Is that good?
I'm not seeing it.
Okay. Let me see if I can get it. Yeah, I've got it in Google Slides, which is always a little tricky, but we will see.
I have found the copy you sent me. If you want me to run it, I can do it.
Yeah, would you do that only because I have
one less
done this on my own Zoom, but yeah, there we go. Okay. Well, first of all, Marie, thank you for the introduction and thank you, Knightdale, for having me this morning. As you can see, most of my background has been financial, but I did get an opportunity to spend a short part of my career in a presidential administration, which I think in those couple of years has probably been the most informative and I would say impactful in my career. As much as I love finance, I baptism by fire, learned a lot when I was inside the White House. So next slide, Marie. Thank you. So this is me. This is my 80s hair, as you can see here, when I was a very young volunteer. I did serve in George H.W. Bush's administration from 88 to 90 and was on his White House staff and the G7 summit as the head of government affairs, which was in Houston that year. I was part of the inauguration, the transition, and the campaign staff. And I should, full disclosure here, and I know Rotary is not a political organization, but I am actually a registered independent in North Carolina. So, so times have changed since H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush and that administration. I'm going to talk a little bit about then and now. So next, Marie. So this is H.W. Bush. Of course, you have heard of him as 41, and his son is referred to as 43. And he up to President Trump, he was the last one-term president. In retrospect, I think most of us would agree that he is now recognized as being a moderate. For those of us that were actually serving him, he was definitely a moderate and very much embraced the bipartisanship. He was very distressed. I don't know if any of you have read his book, but he was very distressed at his son's advisors, who he considered very hardline, to the detriment of his son and the criticism that was levied upon him, because that hardline approach was really coming from 2 of his advisors, who were Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. So that is me inside the Oval Office there. And interesting fun fact, if you were a White House staff member at that time, and this is before, of course, 9/11, you were able to give tours to your friends and family. So you were able to go in and tour the Oval Office and go into any of the now very heavily secured areas in the East Wing and the West Wing. And the West Wing obviously is where the Oval Office is. The staff members typically work in the building next to the White House, the actual White House, called the Executive Office Building. And there is a tunnel that goes underneath and a lot of security to get through that. So you had to have a full field FBI clearance to be able to work in the White House staff. Next. So interestingly, President Bush 41 was criticized during his administration as too compromising, because at the time, things were becoming increasingly partisan. For example, he collaborated with Mikhail Gorbachev, and he tried to, he successfully unified Germany, dissolved the Soviet Union, and ended the Cold War. And that required Mikhail Gorbachev to work with him to do that, which is almost unthinkable in today's world. His personal touches were famous. His work towards harmony was notable. I'm sure that you've heard of the 1,000 points of light. It's actually still exists. The 1,000 points of light was to recognize annually 1,000 people that were volunteers, that were in service, which is, obviously thematically aligned with Rotary. His letter writing was incredible, to the point where his staff, almost, we had to present things slowly, because he would either make a phone call or write a letter, and that meant that we might not be able to drop 15 resumes at one time on him for particular board and commission appointments, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Next, Marie. So I was a member of the White House staff, and I personally got to see some of the tangible evidence of what bipartisan work looks like. I was in presidential personnel. The Office of Presidential Personnel still exists today. It's very integral. Presidential personnel is the clearinghouse for all of the cabinet nominees, as well as all of the major boards and commissions. For example, the Small Business Advisory Council, which I personally worked on. At the time, President Bush asked me to look at recruiting non-white business owners to staff the Small Business Advisory Council, which was, interestingly, a very fun task. And I wouldn't say easy, but it was available. And so we went around the different regions of the country trying to find minority business owners and put them on the SBA, and were successful. The Holocaust Commission I worked on, this was fascinating. This was religious diversity. It was Gentile and Jewish, sects of the Jewish religion. And this was the commission that was in charge of putting together the Holocaust Museum. If you've been to Washington, D.C. and seen the Holocaust Museum, it was developed by this Holocaust Commission, which was bipartisan. So you had a bipartisan commission, religious differences. It was a very interesting dialogue inside those meetings, but obviously the end result was the Holocaust Museum. And the President's Council on Physical Fitness. This is a fun one. I got to interview Arnold Schwarzenegger, who ultimately became the chairman of the President's Council on Physical Fitness. That's a whole story in and of itself. Suffice it to say that he is a gigantic human being in person. And, being that I barely topped 5'3", that was very interesting. But many of these mandated boards and commissions are bipartisan, and are today bipartisan. There are various ways you can go about staffing boards and commissions. The cabinet appointments tend to be very political, but in many cases, even the political appointments on some of these boards that I'm describing require a Democratic representative, Republican representative from a different area. It's very interesting to know that even though you may have a very partisan White House, there are certain directives where you can't overcome the either legislature or charter that has set up a number of these boards and commissions. So that's me again with President Bush. we had to to do a lot of receptions together, and a lot of interviewing, hand screening those resumes. This is before we had the internet and the ability to go online and look at and screen these resumes. Now, of course, they can screen them by background and everything else, but it was really a mess. But we really did have to go one by one through all of these resumes to find qualified candidates to staff these boards. Next slide, Marie. So I want to talk about when did and how did partisan politics become so common? Well, one of the things is, and I am by no means a historian, but I certainly have been very interested in this subject, particularly of late. This partisan politics are not new, right? Our founding fathers, Civil War politics. I mean, these were nasty, argumentative. Perhaps they were more civil and the language was more flowery, but they were no less cunning in the background of what's gone in our history and gone down as partisan politics. However, this is interesting. In the 1950s, bipartisanship was criticized. You actually didn't want bipartisanship. And I know that seems strange to us, but it was very vague and not politically accountable. So what happened is that the leaders of both parties were very entrenched. They were almost tenured, if you will, and they tended to have a lot of compromise that never really took a stand one way or another. It was collaborative, but in many cases, not effective. So, so out of that bipartisanship in the 1950s became, there was some thought brewing, and of course it took traction later that maybe we need to define what each party represents. So next slide. Even in George H.W. Bush's own campaign, I don't want to make him out to be a saint. He was a fantastic man, and his wife I adored. But his campaign manager was Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater, if you don't know who he is, he passed on early in his life from brain cancer. He was from South Carolina, and he was quite a character. He was also probably in many cases one of the first campaign managers to unleash negative campaigning. So you may recall that President Bush ran against Mike Dukakis, and they released an ad about a paroled criminal named Willie Horton, who was out of jail for about a week and ended up raping a woman. So you can imagine what those ads looked like. And Lee was both admired and reviled by opposite sides. So it's too simplistic to say that Lee Atwater was just the founder of negative campaigning, because I knew Lee, and he was a complex man, and he also was a scholar on things like um, uh, rhythm and blues, and he was an accomplished musician and had really given a lot of popularity to Black music and the revival of it. So, like I said, very complex. Okay, next slide. So throughout the early stages of a crisis, bipartisanship usually collapses. That's because everybody's blaming everyone if we have a crisis. However, there were major bipartisan initiatives throughout history that happened at really weird times. I mean, I think we're all familiar with Lincoln's team of rivals. In 1860, he actually appointed to his cabinet all the people he ran against. And the Civil Rights Act, which could never have gotten through in 1964 without bipartisan support. Fascinating. The food stamp program in 1977 was co-sponsored by Bob Dole and George McGovern, if you can even imagine that as a possibility. Social Security reforms, look at the year, 1983. Welfare reforms, 1996. And then Medical Research Reform Bill in 2016. This is something we're not going to see in the press. And I'm not sure that that President Trump's legacy would bear this out well. But there was a huge bipartisan bill that went through in 2016, giving massive amounts of money to research and development and the private-public partnership of a number of health organizations and biotech. And you have to wonder where that led, to in the pandemic. Next slide. This sharp ideological drift, polarization, and division really has its roots in the early to mid 1900s. And I would say specifically with one person, who is Newt Gingrich. In 1994, in a midterm election, he put forth the Contract with America. I don't know if you are familiar with this, but basically it broadly nationalized congressional elections, and the Heritage Foundation was behind its tenets, which you probably know is a fairly conservative organization. So what this did is it specifically tied legislation to a vote. In other words, if you vote for me, I am going to vote on this particular legislation. Whether it was lower taxes, tort reform, or welfare reform, smaller government. There were actually proposed legislation that was put forth by this Contract with America, where candidates then said that they would support it. So this is where you start to see the ideological divide between those that believed in some of the things that the Contract with America is putting forth and those that didn't. Also during this time, and very critically, congressional members were no longer required to be in session for the entire week. So you dissolve the permanence of Washington, D.C. as home to the members. Heretofore, they all moved to Washington, D.C. The members of Congress lived in Washington, D.C. Their children went to the same schools. They had dinner parties together. It was very collegial. You'll see, a picture of President Reagan and Tip O'Neill, and they were great friends. But that is because they lived in Washington, D.C. and didn't go to their home districts on Thursday, returning on Tuesday or Monday night. So that's no longer common, and there's no longer commonly socializing with the opposite sides of the aisle. In fact, if anything, it's discouraged, which is, kind of disappointing. Negative partisanship. I think we probably saw this in the last election. Again, this is all my opinion. But negative partisanship is defined as the hatred of another party on another party more than the love of your own. So again, prior to this negative partisanship, you were looking at a party and whether it represented your point of view. And recently, it's been more about hating the other side than espousing what it is that your party stands for. Okay, next, Marie. So today, there are a lot of calls for bipartisan policies and a need for dignity, respect, and civility. I think that has, really resonated on both sides of the aisle. There is a really interesting group called the Bipartisan Policy Center, and they established a program where the opposite party congressional members can visit each other's district for a weekend. And much like living in the same city and socializing together, I really do think that they're hoping that bipartisan understanding may lead to more constructive legislation. At the very least, I think now we can sort of hope for, as my boss, President George H.W. Bush said multiple times, I want a kinder, gentler nation. Okay, Marie. And then there's some of my sources that I lifted. That is the G7 summit. You probably can see that was Margaret Thatcher's last global summit there. And I worked on that in the middle of July in Houston, which was an experience. Anyway, so that's a little bit of what I have to present, and I would be happy to entertain any questions or any thoughts you have.
I have a question.
Okay.
So the way I understand it, legislation now is put together by these think tanks in and around DC, and they come up with ideas and legislation. Do they think it through enough to approach both sides, or are they is that where the bipartisan starts and then they run it down their party lines?
I think, Jeff, it's probably more of the ideation of individual think tanks, because there aren't too many. I mean, there are some that espouse to be bipartisan, but my experience, okay, I can only speak from my experience. I'm sure the heads of these organizations would disagree, but I think they lean one way or another. At least I get some of the mailings of some of them, and I think there's an obvious point of view. So yes, I don't think that those initiatives are being thought out. Here's the compromise. I think they kind of throw it out there and say, work on the compromise if you can.
And I think if that's where the genius is, because that's what I've heard, that's, maybe the representatives aren't the smartest people, and I get that. But if the genius is in these groups creating the legislation, maybe they could think it through a little bit further on how to make it more representative of everyone affected.
I agree. And also there have been people from various think tanks on both sides that I know have left to do their own organization, and they pride themselves on saying independent thinking, that type of thing.
Okay, thanks.
We've got a couple of questions in chat. David, you want to read your own question?
I guess you mentioned that in the 1950s, the partisan leaders were very entrenched and very partisan. My question is entrenchment part of the issue, quote unquote? And if we had shorter term limits or more turnover or whatever, would that help or hinder?
This is a personal opinion, but I think it would help, because you really do see, being particularly inside the White House, you really do see that the elder statesmen, if you will, for lack of a better term, and that's men or women, that's Nancy Pelosi or, whomever, they have a greater voice, I would say. Now, they are more experienced and they know the way things work, but sometimes the way things work, it gets in the way. So I happen to think that if they shortened it up, that you'd have more new thinking, if you will, new ideas introduced. It's really tough to overcome somebody that has tremendous seniority, because remember that Washington, it's not a capitalist system. It's based on power and perks. Okay, that's how you rise through the system. It's not like you get a ton of money, because you don't. It's not about that. It's about power, perks, and I used to say parking. So it's a little bit of all that. So David, I think, yeah, I mean, whether they'll ever vote on that to vote themselves out of office, I don't know.
Can I add on to that? I'm sorry to monopolize the questions, but with technology the way it is today, and with a Zoom meeting, why couldn't everyone across the nation log in and vote for term limits as a national agenda vote, and see if we could put that out there for everyone to consider, instead of leaving it to the fox to control the lock on the hen
house, right? Yeah. No, I don't disagree, but I guess it would be the same as saying, should we throw it out to all the employees to get rid of the chairman of IBM? It's tough. I don't disagree. I think you're right, but it's going to take some really forward thinking senior people.
David and I are going to start that movement.
There you go. I like it.
I guess my feeling is that the challenges are much more insidious than Congress. I'm personal friends with a county manager here in North Carolina, manages the county. And I've had discussions with him about bipartisanship and partisanship. And, he said all the way down to the county level, whether it be to local level, whether it be county, city, town, whatever, there is no center anymore. all of the elected officials are on the two poles, left or right. And I think it starts at the county level, and we're already seeing it after the last election, where the gerrymandering and the changes in the laws, the voting laws in Georgia, for example, are setting up to make sure, as best they can, that in this case, and I'm not picking on them, but in this case, Republicans take back Congress in 2022. It also happens when the Democrats are in power. So I think the issue is much, much bigger than our politicians sitting in Washington, D.C.
But they can, I think the only thing about that, David, is my experience has been that they influence, they have tremendous influence. You're right. They can't vote at the county level, but they certainly, especially at the senatorial level and the congressional level, your individual congressmen and the senators, they certainly influence. And I'm thinking about right now, I lived in Georgia for 17 years. I'm from the Northeast. Okay. So I'm actually from Pennsylvania, and I worked in New York a long time, but I lived in Atlanta for 17 years. And there were a number of what we now call blue dog Democrats. I would say, moderate Republican type of leaders, senators, governors in that state that really had a very different approach to what we have now. So I think you're right. It does happen at the local level, but they also look, these are ambitious people at the local level too, right? They want to eventually try and move up or move along or run for Senate or governor or something along those lines. So I think they do take their lead from the top down more than we probably think, because after all, legislation, the beginning at the top, right? We see what the trends are, and they're sort of falling in line. But to your point, the partisan, the non-center right now really began. I mean, you could argue that it began in the late 70s and through the 80s, but it really came to a head in the early 90s.
So going back to safer ground of the 1990s, you mentioned the role played by Newt Gingrich. Would you care to comment on the role played by Tom DeLay?
Oh, you can argue both sides, right? I mean, I think you have to argue both sides. This is, guilty as charged. So I think it's, I think there's some partisan politics going on both sides right now, and it's very polarizing. But yes, David, yes, of course. I mean, they're both involved in this. The only difference is that early in his career, Newt Gingrich, and this was to a college group of Republicans, and this is back in 1978, said, and I'm paraphrasing, I think you should go, this is to the college Republicans, I think you should go out and be nasty. And the reason I think that is because we as Republicans have been too gentlemanly. We have been, trying to play by the rules, and you need to get out there and basically knock down the other side. Now, I'm not saying that Tom Delaney or anybody else, on the Democratic side hasn't said the same thing. I think they probably have. Yeah. But it is just that, he's a firebrand, right? That's why we pick on him a little bit, because he's just out there.
Yeah, I just read an interesting article this week that said that the title was what Joe Biden really learned in the Senate. And it was not bipartisanship. It was you do whatever it takes to win. And I think that applies across the board.
Oh, yes. And that's how you, and I would say that not only as president, but Senate now too, also.
Yeah.
I think Doris had a question if I read her body language, right?
That was weird. I completely disappeared the screen. I didn't really, I know I'm afraid of, I just was gonna say something about, you said about IBM and the employees.
Mhm.
And to me, it's the employees didn't hire the CEO of IBM. We hire the
That's true.
politicians.
Very good point. So
So,
we should be able to boot him out is what you're saying.
well, we should be able to demand things. Like, I think that when they put a bill out or whatever, and they attach all that crap to it, I think it should just be one thing. I think that they should have term limits and we should be able to vote on that. And I also think that if they vote on something, they should have to suffer the consequences like all of us. So in other words, like Obamacare, they should be under Obamacare too, if we're all under Obamacare. They shouldn't have anything separate. Those kinds of things.
I don't disagree. It's a very rarefied group up there and a little bit removed from their constituencies, really, once they get there.
I agree.
Anybody else have any questions? Do you, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, was this helpful to you? I think I found it absolutely fascinating, continue to find it fascinating. My